Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us and welcome to the Trustees Conservation in Action webinar series. My name is Rob Warren. I am Managing Director of Conservation here at the Trustees. I want to start with a quick note that on your screen, if you would like to enable closed captioning for this, for the webinar today, you can see down at the bottom of your screen next to the Q&A button, there is a live transcript option that opens a short menu, and you can select show a live transcript and then show subtitle, and that will create closed caption for you as we go. So I am joined today by David Santamena, our Associate Director of Land Conservation. And we have two special guests with us today, Olivia Lukasik, who is our Creighton Conservation Specialist, and Elizabeth Carey Sewell, who is a landscape architect with our Structures and Landscape team. And you'll be hearing from each of us through the coming hour. So again, thank you again for joining us. We were talking today about our Elliott Initiative, and we'll explain a little bit about what that is and then share some recent examples of projects in our land acquisition program work. So each of our 124 reservations has its own unique history, its own treasures to offer. And our team here in the Land Conservation Department stewards and across the landscape, our curators, our ecologists, and many others all play a critical role in bringing these places to life for our visitors. Today, you'll hear about the work that we're doing scouting out future reservations where we will protect important resources and then engage the public around those resources. Well, this body of work is what we call our Elliott Initiative. Like all of our work at the Trustees, these efforts would not be possible without the support of our donors, and we cannot thank them and you enough for that support. So as much of the world has gone virtual in the past couple of years, we've created online programming like this webinar series. Our team has also done an incredible job across the Commonwealth, keeping our properties open and operating safely for visitors. We saw over 2 million visitors to our properties just this past year, as many people have gained a renewed appreciation for nature and found new value in getting outside at Trustees properties. So we do hope that these webinars will inspire you to get out and explore a Trustees property near you and help you learn about our many new projects and initiatives. And we believe this work will help us get the next generation outdoors as well and build the Trustees of the future. So thank you again for supporting our mission to protect and share the places that people love across Massachusetts. Throughout the webinar, you can click on the Q&A button and submit any questions you have. And we may pause along the way for a question here or there, but we'll certainly address questions at the end of the presentation. So for 130 years, the Trustees of Reservations have been acquiring special places. That is where we started. It remains at the core of our work. Even as the organization has engaged much more broadly with the people and places of Massachusetts. In 1897, we acquired both Mount Ann Park and the Rocky Woods reservations. These are the earliest special places that we still own and manage today. And just a month and a half ago, we got our most recent reservation at Moraine Farm in Beverly, and we'll be talking more about that later in the hour. In the intervening century, we have conserved exceptional resources across the Commonwealth, from Ipswich to Martha's Vineyard, Provincetown out to Williamstown, and that work goes on and on. Our current strategic plan, known as Momentum, has kept us pressing this work forward, calling for the acquisition of 4 new reservations over the 5-year span of the strategic plan, while also pressing for the creation of first Boston waterfront park. So as I noted, we call this body of work our Elliott Initiative. The searching out, for new reservation opportunities, vetting and evaluating those opportunities, envisioning what that particular place could become, and then developing a plan for creating that reservation as the vision was created. It takes a broad group of colleagues through the process, but our team takes the lead here in Land Conservation on bringing possible places into the process. Potential reservations do sometimes find us, but much more often we are prospecting for opportunities. And as you know, our mission is broad, and even so, it is built on these two key elements. Those key foundational pieces for us are the protection and preserving of significant resources, and then engaging the public around those places. That's been part of our mission from day one, and it remains part of our mission today. So there are in fact many elements that go into making a successful trustees reservation beyond simply saying, here's a good place and people will want to come. So there are a lot of places in our communities across the state which could, in theory, be acquired and managed by the trustees, but in fact, only a much smaller number which would really thrive and help us fulfill the mission of the organization. So as I noted, the mission is very broad, and so the range of resources that we consider in this process is similarly broad. Exceptional natural places, important historic houses on significant landscapes, museums and collections, farmlands, exceptional recreational opportunities, any of these, or more commonly several of these, create the foundation of a new reservation. We add into this the potential for engaging the public at that place, around that resource, in a way that educates without being damaging to that resource. All of that changes the calculus again in evaluating what places would be the best next reservations. So it might work in the movies, but if you build it, they will come does not work so well in land conservation. So we strive for a deeper understanding of the potential of each site. What is the story that we can tell at this place around this resource? What is the experience that we can offer visitors? What will a visitor be remembering about the time they spent at our reservation several days later when they're telling friends about the weekend they spent there? So there are places across the state that we are particularly interested in finding new reservations to help us become even more accessible to more people across the Commonwealth. So we are actively seeking out new opportunities in these areas, such as the Mid and Outer Cape Cod, Boston itself and the Metro West area, and the area around Worcester. It's the second largest city in New England, and we would very much like to be engaging that population around a significant trustees reservation. Obviously, these are not the only places we're looking, but these are gaps in our portfolio that we do hope to fill in the coming years. So where do projects come from? All kinds of places. Over the past decades, we've built a list of over 150 places to keep an eye on. We talk about this as our Elliott list. Some of the properties on there will certainly be culled out of that group as we take a closer look and learn more about them. You know, some we will find do not really meet the threshold tests for becoming a trustees reservation. But there are also gems in that collection, some of which we already know are gems and some of which we have yet to discover as special gems. So that work also goes on as we further vet projects that are on that list. A good example from that list actually is Moraine Farm, again, our most recent reservation. And that's something that the trustees has worked on for over 20 years. We acquired pieces over time, and as David will explain in a little bit, have eventually slowly, patiently worked to create a reservation around what we always knew was a tremendous resource and opportunity. So this long view is not unique to the trustees, but certainly we are perhaps uniquely positioned for many such opportunities. We also work with local advocates, sometimes us going to them to find out what's on their mind and in their scope. Often folks bring projects to us, a whole range of partner organizations, municipalities, other nonprofits. And a key element of this, of course, is our governance and our friends. So part of building that pipeline relies on folks like you bringing great opportunities to us. We always check out everything, every random phone call. We map it, we look into it, and we come to try and understand whether it has potential to be a trustee's place. So we do ask you to help us be our eyes and ears across the Commonwealth. So the process for that vetting and reviewing, it's not the most exciting part of our work to talk about, but it is key to just a successful creation of a successful reservation. So we rely heavily in that process on the expertise of many colleagues. You'll be hearing from one of those today, our landscape architect colleague. So as we vet an opportunity, the question isn't just, is this a good place, but how does it rank within sort of its realm, within other properties of that type? We want to be representing to the public the best examples of what we can find across Massachusetts. So we have a series of decision points as we get deeper and deeper into any specific opportunity to try and understand it, understand the resource, what it would take to conserve and preserve and steward that resource over time, how we would engage the public around that resource. We have a number of sort of threshold moments in that process where we are making a sort of yes/no decision about whether we continue to pursue that possibility. That certainly includes our governance with the Land Conservation Committee being very involved in those evaluations and determinations, and of course, ultimately an act by our board of directors, which reviews and approves every new reservation that we take on. So our methods have evolved over the decades as well. In our earliest days, from our earliest days, we have been a participant in the real estate market. And often that is at something less than market value for a property. So what we talk about as bargain sales has been a key tool in our toolbox from the very early days, where we pay less than the market value for a property that can create a partial tax deduction opportunity for a landowner while conserving conservation dollars to spread to other projects as well. We've also relied heavily on the charitable commitments of those who have owned special places. Many of the places that we are known best for came to us as gifts from their owners when that was the appropriate time. You know, Castle Hill and Crane Beach is one of our kind of benchmark properties, and I'm always intrigued by the reaction of folks to learn that the house at Castle Hill had been built only 20 years prior to its donation to the trustees. So these are not always ancient things. Today we think of it as an important artifact of the past, but in fact it was very much part of someone's life at the time that it came to the trustees. So only in 1999 did we shift to long-term management agreements as a way to take on a reservation. In that year, we entered into a lease agreement with the Army Corps of Engineers for our Tully Lake campground property. So that is a place, if you go there, you have a trustee's experience. It is trustees staff and trustees expertise that is supporting you there. But in fact, the land is owned by the Army Corps of Engineers under a long-term agreement with the trustees, and that's true at a handful of our properties. So Mary Cummings Park is an example of that, where the land is owned by the city of Boston, but we've recently opened a reservation there and welcomed the public under a trustees banner while recognizing our partnership with the city of Boston as well. We have also worked through affiliations and mergers for a handful again of our reservations, working with organizations who were seeking a more predictable and sustainable future for the resources in their care. And you will hear more today soon about Armstrong-Kelley Park down on the Cape, which is an example of that sort of pathway to actual trustees ownership, but rather than through a land transaction, through more of an organizational combination. So with that context, I want to move us towards projects.
And hi, Rob. I just have one question for you before you do that. Will you cover the process of how to reach out to see if a property is on your radar?
Sure. Yes, you can contact, any of us here in Land Conservation. There is on the Land Conservation page on the trustees website, there is a general information email address that gets fed to David or myself generally, although actually a lot of it will be going to Olivia, who joined us just in January. So when those come in, we basically take it in. If it's something that we are aware of and familiar with, we may seize the moment to try and learn a little bit more about it. If it's something that one of you is reaching out on, then you may know more about it than we do. And we welcome that additional information into the process.
Okay, thank you.
Great, thank you. So as I say, with this context of how we do our work, I want to hand it off to David, who will talk us through a few specific examples with our other colleagues in support. Thank you, David.
Sure, thanks, Rob. So I'm going to take us through a discussion of 3 new reservations. Actually, let me back up for a second. I'm gonna outline sort of the broad range of our land conservation work. Rob just focused on our Elliott or new reservation work, so I'm going to talk about 3 new reservations. We're also going to give you a glimpse into a recent acquisition of what we call a reservation priority land. Olivia is going to give us some insights into a recent conservation restriction. And then we're going to circle back to Rob for a quick overview of what we sort of in the trade call trade land donations. But jumping into the new reservations, Rob referenced on a couple of occasions our newest reservation at Moraine Farm in Beverly. Moraine Farm is located located in Beverly, in sort of North Beverly, close to the Wenham line. It has frontage on Wenham Lake and is an Olmsted designed landscape dating back to the 1890s. Ownership, and Rob, if you could, the ownership of Moraine Farm is quite complicated, and really what we're in is a process of trying to consolidate the ownership here and make it a little bit less fragmented. Our history with Moraine Farm goes back 30 years when the first interest in real estate we acquired there was a conservation and preservation restriction, which we were granted by the long-term owners, the Batchelder family. We share the holding of that restriction with the local regional land trust, the Essex County Greenbelt Association. So that was circa 1990. That restriction was then rather exhaustively amended in 1999. And at that point in time, about a 66-acre parcel of the property was sold to another nonprofit called Project Adventure. Over time, the property also became the home for the Waring School, not the Waring School, apologies, the Waldorf School of Moraine Farm, as well as a private residence, and the Batchelder family continues to own significant portions of the property. But flash forward to December of last year, and our ownership pattern looked like this. We owned 4 parcels of land. Somewhat remarkably, none of them touched each other. They're outlined in green. And so there was quite a jigsaw puzzle of our ownership there. Outlined in red is our recent acquisition, the 66 acres owned by Project Adventure, which in one fell swoop enabled us to combine all of our parcels into one sort of coherent whole, and thereby create the opportunity for a full-fledged trustees reservation. Rob. Flashing back for a moment, I referenced this as a Olmsted design landscape. It was one of his earlier residential designs, and Olmsted scholars, consider it to be significant in that regard, as it predates some of his larger, more well-known residential landscapes like Biltmore in Asheville, North Carolina, for example. But Olmsted very much had a tripartite vision of the property. He envisioned it as having an active agricultural component, a wooded or forest component, and then an estate component. And those three elements still very much exist on the property and are part of what we're in a position to now share with the public. In this illustration from a magazine article of the time, you can see sort of right in the center, so the core, the agricultural part of the property. Tucked up against Wenham Lake, you can see the estate house at the center of the property. And you can also see 3 carriage drives or carriage loops, which were really a defining sort of landscape feature of the time and of this property. And those 3 loops still basically exist and are a large part of what we're going to be able to offer the public who visit us, is the ability to retrace those steps that Olmsted envisioned 130 years ago at this point in time. So that's pretty remarkable. Next slide, Rob. So this is just sort of some of the bullet points that for us really encapsulate what was special about Moraine Farm. It's a very intact, significant design landscape by the preeminent American landscape designer. It's in remarkable condition, given its age and the number of different ownerships that have passed through. And that's really thanks in great part to the foresight of the Batchelder family, who put the original conservation and preservation restriction on the property. It's highly accessible. It's basically a couple minutes off of Route 128. Route 1A runs right along the property, and it's actually fairly accessible from MBTA train and bus routes as well. So we're really trying to create as much as possible a variety of different ways for folks to access and experience our properties. The property has for a long time been the site of a pretty active events business, which is not our core focus, but it is a way that we're going to be subsidizing the significant cost of maintaining the property. But it's a really terrific platform for a whole variety of programming. And we're just beginning to scratch the surface on what that's going to look like. But starting with a broad array of Olmsted themed events for folks who are students of landscape architecture will be pretty desirable, as well as more traditional, Moraine Farm Fall Festival, or the Trail Network will really lend itself to maybe trail runs or snowshoe events or things of that nature. And again, given our proximity to significant population centers, we think those are going to be pretty popular. The property still has an active agricultural component to it, which at the moment is under lease to the New Entry Sustainable Farming Partnership, which is a Tufts University affiliate. They're going to continue to run their farmer training and outreach programs on the property, and that's a terrific partnership for us. And then, as I said, the existing trail network, and as we're going to enhance it a little bit, will be a really attractive option for folks to come visit us in an unstructured sort of way. And lastly, I would just note that the city of Beverly owns a parcel of open space land immediately to the north, also along Wenham Lake, formerly part of Moraine Farm and the original Phillips family ownership. And so the two properties really will function together as a significant open space destination. So there's a really great partnership there with the city of Beverly as well. So this is an example of, Rob sort of took through some of the ways we acquire property. So this was a purchase at fair market value from Project Adventure as a nonprofit. And I should quickly acknowledge the really terrific work that our development staff did to raise $3.2 million in a very short amount of time last year, in a very challenging time frame. But jumping to Becket on the eastern flank of the Berkshires. Talk a little bit about our recent acquisition of the Becket Historic Quarry and Forest, which is an example of an acquisition via gift. In this case, a donation from the local land trust, the Becket Land Trust. So again, this is now land we own in fee and have the ability to manage according to our principles. So it's a traditional reservation structure in that sense. And just to put us in context, Rob, if you could. So Becket is, as I said, sort of on the eastern flank of the Berkshires. We're actually right, a part of the property abuts the Mass Pike, but in fact, the closest exit off of the Mass Pike is 10 miles in either direction. So while it's close to a transportation artery, it's one of those places that you kind of have to get to, but once you get there, it's absolutely worth the work. So it's property is mostly in Becket and actually a little bit in Otis, and we have a close up in the next map. And so you can see the pike running right along the southerly edge of the property there. But what we have is basically about 290 acres of land. So it's a substantial ownership, even for that part of the state where the ownerships are a little larger than in the east. But there's a long, slender neck connecting the bulk of the property to Quarry Road, cleverly named. And that corridor was formerly the location of the Quarry Railroad, which moved blocks of granite from the quarry itself, which you can see as that dark black pond in this site, down the hill to Quarry Road to a different railroad, and then eventually to Chester for where it was further processed. But it's a nice, big, cohesive block of high quality forested habitat. The open spaces that you see sort of along the western and southern sides of the property are actually restoration areas that the Becket Land Trust had undertaken with some grant funding that they were able to secure. So it's got both very interesting industrial archaeological focus. And the next image, I think, is going to show that. So let me give a little bit of a perspective on how this came to be. The property was acquired by the local Becket Land Trust, so in partnership with the town of Becket, which had a right of first refusal that they transferred to the local land trust, who were then able to raise the money they needed to purchase the property. And they ran it for about 20 years as an open space property, and featuring both sort of the quarry history of the property as well as the open space and forest aspects. And here you can see sort of very traditional land trust type signage standards. Next slide, Rob. So the property is really defined by that historic quarry use, which ran for nearly 100 years and terminated probably in the 1940s, although it continued at a very small sort of localized scale for a few years after that. So the property is characterized with this kind of relic, which at this point are sort of gracefully melting into the landscape, I think you could say. So we certainly don't see them as an eyesore in any sense. They're really part of what makes the property unique and interesting. Go to the next slide, Rob. But this is the quarry pit itself, which is now obviously full of water to a great depth. But some of the things that really intrigued us about this as a reservation opportunity was the fact that the Becket Land Trust folks had been very successful in attracting visitors to the property, perhaps more successful than they dreamed, because one of their considerations in seeking a partner was that they just felt like the stewardship and managing the visitation had gotten a little bit beyond their capacity, and were seeking a larger entity to support them in that. But so we knew that the property had the ability to really draw significant numbers of visitors, which again is an important consideration for us. That sort of quarry industrial history is unique across the trustees' 120 plus properties. We have lots of beautiful estates and formal gardens and beaches and ponds, but we really don't have anything that fits this profile. So this sort of fills a little bit of a niche for us in our portfolio of reservation types. Also a consideration was the very significant work that the Becket Land Trust had done in creating very good reservation infrastructure in terms of parking and trails and signage. So while we knew we were taking on a significant management requirement, it came with a lot of infrastructure. Otherwise, we would have had to create, and in many cases have to create from the ground up. So we were able to take advantage of that. And this is a geography that we're interested in expanding our presence in. So tick that box for us. And again, it's a really, the natural resources in addition to the sort of cultural resources are excellent and have been augmented by the work that the Becket Land Trust did in terms of some of that restoration work. And I think that takes us to Armstrong-Kelley Park in Barnstable in the Osterville neighborhood. And this is an example of a reservation acquired through a merger in this case, or an affiliation. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that acquisition process, and then Elizabeth Keary-Sewell is going to talk a little bit about the work that we're now launched on to enhance and improve the core of the property that we acquired. So Armstrong-Kelley Park was, as I said, is right in the center of Osterville, right on Main Street in Osterville, in the town of Barnstable. So it's a very visible sort of core community location. The property itself is about an 8-acre in-town parcel. And Rob, if we could. So there you see Main Street to the south, and you can sort of see the core of the park development right off of Main Street. And really, the majority of the parcel is open space, wooded, laced with a system of trails and a couple of different connections out to the public road system. But the defining characteristic of the park is really that front part of the property where the walkways and boardwalks and trails and plant installations are for the most part. So it had been owned by the Cape Cod Horticultural Society for 80 or 90 years. And it was, again, their only real estate asset. Like many organizations, they were looking at challenges around succession, and they're an all-volunteer organization, and were having sort of recruitment challenges for their board and leadership. And so while they were in good shape at the time, they were looking down the road and not really envisioning, not necessarily seeing a robust future for the organization, but cared a lot about the property and wanted to make very sure that it was well in good hands going forward. And in that context, reached out to us. As Rob referenced earlier, the Cape is a focused area for us. We have a campground in Provincetown and a couple of properties on the Lower Cape, but nothing really in this part of Cape Cod. So this was an opportunity, both in terms of geography, but also the property plays off of our expertise with public gardens that we've developed in places like Long Hill and Stevens Coolidge Place as well. So we felt like we brought some expertise to the table. And this was something that, again, the volunteer group had done a terrific job of managing over time, but we did see some opportunities to expand and enhance that experience. And so we see this as a placemaking opportunity, not creating it from the start, but really making it into more of a destination and more of a vibrant resource for that community. We go to the next slide. So this is a conceptual design that was put together by Mick Young Kim, who's a Boston-based landscape architect. And this is really playing off of the existing layout and structure of the park. So again, most of the activity is focused on the Main Street side of the property, and it gets sort of less formal and less developed as you get towards the wooded rear of the property. And we really didn't introduce any completely new elements. These are really expansions and elaborations of existing elements. We did see some opportunities to rethink sort of traffic and circulation, and parking in particular was identified by the CCH folks as a real, as a bit of an Achilles heel for the property. Just didn't have adequate parking. Even though many folks can walk there, there's still some demand for parking, and they wanted to be able to address that. So this was actually part of, we had even though the property came to us through this merger and affiliation process at no expense in terms of acquisition, we did we did know it was going to require a significant amount of investment, and we had a $2+ million capital campaign, and this plan was sort of put together to support that that campaign. Once the property was in our control, we handed off to our landscape and structures team to take the sort of conceptual design and translate it into something that would actually be built on the ground. So Elizabeth, do you want to?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Curie-Soul. And as both Rob and David mentioned, I am on the project management team, structures and landscapes. We are on the statewide stewardship team. And so we manage projects all over the state. If you could actually go to the next page, Rob. So I'm going to start with here. So I came into this project after this conceptual plan had been completed. And we are now entering the property activation phase of this project, which is really bringing this conceptual plan to reality. Putting together a conceptual plan like this is actually a really crucial part of property activation for multiple reasons. It raises excitement about the trustees establishing ownership. It raises funds, and then it also gets everyone's goals in one place. So this was produced in close consort with the Cape Cod Horticultural Society and with other public garden stakeholders. So once we have this beautiful plan, it's my job to actually figure out how we can implement this. And so you'll see here that we established a list of priorities. So first, it's very functional needs. David talked about needing certain parking areas. So we have the parking as part of the first phase. We also have a need for maintenance sheds. So this is just to support those daily operations and also to support on-site engagement. So for programs, we need to have room for staff and storage. And then also highlighting the establishment of this place as a trustees public garden, one of our public gardens. So care for things like all of their existing specimens, doing a living collections cataloging and labeling of all those existing specimens, planting new specimens to diversify our horticultural collections here. So you'll see some of these areas like the wetland, the aquatic garden, the play garden are all part of that first phase of work. And you'll see the upland area, which is more of that wooded area, is part of a phase 2 project here. If you could go to the next page, Rob. So there's a couple of different ways that we take a beautiful conceptual plan, like what Mick-Young Kim has produced, and implement it. The first is we take that concept plan and we actually walk through the site with all of the necessary stakeholders. That can be, of course, the Cape Cod Horticultural Society, all of our internal stakeholders, or it could be people like the town, staff members from the town, our abutters, people like this. And we actually look at existing views that need to be buffering. You can see in that left picture there, we have a view into our neighboring property that really needs to be buffered. That middle picture is showing an example of one of the internal views that we really wanted to make sure was highlighted. And then we also walk around with an eye for maintenance. So Armstrong-Kelley has a really extensive boardwalk system existing. And unfortunately, boardwalks are very high maintenance. They can be really slippery when they're wet. And they're also not a sort of a functional necessity here. So one of the main pieces of this activation phase is replacing some of these existing boardwalks with at-grade accessible paths. And then I also wanted to include here just a visual of who the core team members are at this phase in a project. So of course we have our property director, and this is the person who establishes the engagement needs, the sort of visitor orientation and experience, and then also enterprise needs. So this is the person who says, I need to be able to have a tent for 200 people this many times during the summer. And so we make sure that that central green is large enough to meet the capacity of those needs, so that our property director can have their pro formas met, very functional things like that. Of course, the local stewardship team is a really important part of our core team at this phase. They establish the needs for ongoing maintenance. So they need a place to store their vehicles, their tools, and then also they manage the volunteer group who, as David mentioned, is core members of that Cape Cod Horticultural Society. And then of course, this is a trustee's public garden. So the horticulture team is a crucial part of the team. And they also provide maintenance needs. So they determine things like how wide do the paths need to be so that their horticultural vehicles can access certain parts of the garden. They also tell us, where things need to be irrigated, where they need to have water access. And then, of course, the marketing and communications team helps us with things like wayfinding and site branding and things like that. So that's really the core team. Of course, folks like Land Con, the finance department, and development continue to be in the mix during this phase. But this is the team that sort of I work with to get the project implementation happening. And then, of course, we have design and engineering consultants. These are the folks who help us to produce permitting or regulatory drawings. So what we're in, the phase that we're in right now is the design, development, and permitting drawing production. When we marry that conceptual design with all of the realities of the site, our regulatory limitations, and also those functional needs to meet daily operations and enterprise efforts, that's where we get our permitting drawings. And of course, water management is a huge part of the regulatory requirements here, which is frankly true at every site we own. Water management is huge. There is a wetland here. And there will also be sort of water management requirements. Infiltration basins will be a big part of this project. So we do have an engineering consultant who's helping us with that. However, I just wanted to note, the permitting process when we have projects like this is generally managed internally by our project management team. It's a huge part of what our team does. And so we're now preparing to enter permitting later this month, and we have a first phase of work that's slated for this spring. And the bulk of this construction, so the parking, the main green, that little, the stewardship engagement shed, and then also a lot of the sort of garden renovation work will happen in the fall. So lots going on and lots to look forward to. Back to you, David.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was super. I see we have a couple of quick questions on new reservations before we launch into a very brief overview of a couple of other acquisition types. We're running a little short on time. There's a question about the timeline for opening Moraine Farm, which is, we're still in the process of sort of nailing that down, but we are just, obviously launching sort of the planning process. There's going to be a vetting process with our many partners on the property. And, we're going to need to create parking and make some trail improvements and signage. So we're looking at probably the better part of a year before the property is fully formally open to the public. And there's also a question about accessibility. And Elizabeth can chime in here as well, but we do try to incorporate accessible features and parking and sort of all of our new improvements. Certainly that's a big focus at Armstrong-Kelley, and we will be including accessible parking at Moraine Farm. We're dealing with an existing trail network there that's frankly, while it's not particularly rugged, it doesn't meet the technical definition for accessibility. So that's going to be a bit of a challenge. But as we take these properties on board incrementally, we always look at opportunities to improve accessibility.
Just to add to that, David, accessibility is an essential part of all of the design work that our team does. And so Armstrong-Kelley Park, as David said, the parking and all of the site pathways will be made sure to be accessible.
Yeah, one of the many problems with those boardwalks is they're very unsafe for people who have mobility challenges. So skipping just really quickly to we've been talking about our new reservations. The land conservation team also works on a variety of other types of projects, and we're just going to quickly tick through a couple of those. I'm going to talk about an acquisition of what we call, with our sort of internal jargon, a reservation priority land. Those who have known the organization for some time may recall the term critical land. These are in some properties that abut or relate to our existing reservations, and we try to enhance the protection or the visitor experience at those reservations through the protection or acquisition of these reservation priority lands. In this instance, we're looking at a recent purchase of land from National Grid at the Ward Reservation in North Andover. You can see in that inset map, the squiggly red parcel at the north is the one we're talking about. And you can see that it really buffers the Ward Reservation in the green overlay and the trail network in black from those residential neighborhoods coming in from the north. And while it wasn't particularly threatened with development, anytime we can have some buffer between our holdings and trails in particular and abutting residential uses, that's always beneficial. So this had been a priority established many years ago through a reservation management planning process, worked through kind of a protracted process with National Grid to get them to a place where they were authorized to sell the property, and had an agreement, a formal agreement in place as to the price. Rob, if you could click forward. As a regulated utility, they have an obligation to get sort of fair value for any real estate that they dispose of. So we had to work through a negotiations process around that. This is about a 12-acre parcel. And we were able to acquire this again in October of last year, again, with funding provided through a capital campaign managed by our development department. But this was a really important property for our ward property committee. So if you're looking at that reservation in particular, this was one of the better opportunities to expand and enhance that. And so they really took on a lot of ownership and responsibility for this project. So we were able to wrap that up at the end in October of last year. So we now have a better buffered trail system. And now I'm going to hand off to Olivia, who's going to talk about a recent conservation restriction project down in Westport.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Again, my name's Olivia Lukasik, and my position is actually a new position to the land conservation team. So I'm very excited to be joining them. And as a native Massachusetts resident, I'm really excited to work on projects across the state. So jumping into conservation restrictions in particular, when we think of the trustees' work on the land conservation side, there's the properties that we own completely in fee, as Rob and David have talked about, but we also help with conservation across the state through holding and stewarding what are called conservation restrictions. And these types of properties have changed in how we view and acquire them over the years. And so really the focus for the trustees when they're thinking about acquiring a new conservation restriction needs to look at two strategic reasons. A parcel needs to either preserve the context of a current reservation. So for example, that could be a piece of property that is abutting a reservation, as this image shows from Long Point Wildlife Refuge on the vineyard. And the other main reason would be if there's just a network of multiple restrictions or multiple ownerships in an area that the trustees thinks it's valuable to have another piece of restriction in that premises. So we're going to talk specifically about one conservation restriction that was acquired last year in Westport, which is the Santos Brothers Farm. And this farm was over 120 acres. And the Santos brothers and their family had been farming this piece of property for about 3 generations. It was a dairy farm with about 80 cattle supported by the hayfields and different agricultural parts of the property. Known as the Shy Brothers on the commercial market, they were actually really well known for making some delicious cheese. But the family decided that this property was no longer viable for them to continue farming on it. However, the property is incredibly beautiful. It has this amazing scenic vista on it, and it's really important for the town's rural identity. And so if we go to the next slide, Rob, the Westport Land Conservation Trust entered into an agreement with the Santos brothers, and they actually had a bit of a creative solution to this parcel. So what we're seeing in this map here is the entirety of the red outline is the Santos brothers farm, but it's actually been divided into parcel A and parcel B. Parcel A has a conservation restriction that is held by the Westport Land Conservation Trust and the town, but they're actually selling that land to a farmer so that the land can continue to be used for agricultural uses. Really amazing prime ag soils on site and continuing that agricultural tradition in the town. But if we specifically look at parcel B, this is where the trustees becomes involved. So the Westport Land Conservation Trust donated a conservation restriction to the trustees to really be the stewards of that 43 acres in parcel B. And when we think about the reasons why the trustees would acquire a new property, the second one I mentioned was really that context. So if we look on this map, all of the yellow CRs that are in this particular frame are actually conservation restrictions that the trustees do in fact steward. This project was really important in terms of thinking about not only the agricultural value of the land, but also some really great habitat for some tributaries to a cold water stream on the southern aspect of the property, really great forest land, and also that scenic character for the town. And just one additional piece here, the project was really great for the trustees to engage in just in terms of the relationship with the Westport Land Conservation Trust, because in the past, we'd done a lot of work with them. And so it was great to be partnering them again currently and ongoing into the future. So that was a super quick little bit of one example of a conservation restriction. And I think it's going back over to David to talk about trade lands.
Actually, Rob has this one.
Oh, over to Rob.
Great, thank you, Olivia. Sorry to have to rush you at the end here, but so I do just want to note as we head towards our close and any questions that have come in. A final category of our work that we wanted to talk about, as David mentioned earlier, we call them trade lands. They are better described as non-conservation land gifts. So these are a terrific way for a landowner to contribute to the mission of the trustees. It really is a gift, a monetary gift of land. That's poorly put. It's a gift of land with the intent of donating the monetary value of that land to trustees rather than conservation value as we do in many other land gifts. So in the case I want to talk through quickly here, we are in the town of Sherburne and a landowner wanted to donate the parcel that we see here outlined in red. That is Farm Pond to the south and Little Farm Pond up there at the north. And as you can see, this is in an area with a fair amount of conservation. And so our first question was, is this a conservation property or is this a trade land? Situation. And so as we looked at the land itself, you can see it is improved with a house there in the center overlooking the pond to the southwest. There are a couple of barns. There's a riding area, as you can see at the south end near the road, and these beautiful fields that give views to Little Farm Pond to the north and the small pond on the property. And it abuts land of Mass Audubon Society. So that, as I say, an early question was whether there's a conservation element here, or is this really more of a traditional trade land kind of situation? There's a fair amount of improvement, 2 barns. Here you're seeing a view from the bench on the deck down to the little duck pond there. Horse stalls in both barns, and a sizable house built in the 1970s. And the question for us here really was, is there a conservation overlay? And ultimately, we felt that the land itself did not need to be owned in conservation. It really was a residential property. It's 11.5 acres with a fair amount of improvements on it. And what we ended up doing in the end was putting a restrictive covenant on the land held by Mass Audubon, which basically says it has to remain in residential use. It can't be subdivided for multiple residences. But that, the homeowner can engage in the range of things that a homeowner could engage in here. So if they want to have, rent stalls in the barns and, use it as a horse operation associated with a residence, that would be fine. So we put that in place and then put it on the market, working with wonderful broker in the area who worked pro bono for us, Martha Boland at Compass, a branch of Compass Real Estate. And we were able to sell the property at the end of the year in December, closing almost on New Year's Eve for $1.7 million, making it a tremendous monetary gift to the organization. Now in private hands with someone who has agricultural goals for the land and subject to that overlay to make sure that it doesn't become sort of a problem in the neighborhood and just remains much as it is. So again, we do these from time to time. They're a wonderful way to give to the trustees, and they enjoy, some folks may be more accustomed to the idea of a stock gift where you can make a gift of stock. You're not paying capital gains tax on the appreciated value, and you are able, in many cases, to deduct the value of the total value of the gift. So it's very similar to that sort of arrangement. And we have our colleague Julie Lazarus in our planning giving department who works with us on those projects, and we're always happy to see them come in the door. So that does bring us to a close. We have just a couple of minutes. Javon, I think I saw a question or two pop in. Do we want to go quickly to those?
Yeah, we have time for one question, Rob, today. Any unanswered questions, however, we will respond to via email post the webinar, okay? So for today, how has COVID-19 impacted opportunities for new reservations?
David, you want to jump in on that?
Sure. I think it's fair to say that our initial thinking around how COVID-19 was going to affect our work was completely off. We actually started out thinking that there might be, somewhat perversely, some opportunities created for acquisitions if there was a precipitous decline in the real estate markets. And that, I think, as everyone is aware, that didn't happen. So the market instead went crazy. People were not, looking to dispose of properties that they didn't have to. And so that our initial thinking around what those opportunities might look like was incorrect. There were a couple of things that did arise as sort of a direct result of COVID, and I would again point back to Moraine Farm. Project Adventure, which was the nonprofit that owned and ran programming on that parcel, was heavily impacted by COVID in terms of their ability to deliver their programming. So that as an organization, they were under some stress, and I think that is a large part of why they were forced to put that property on the market. I should note at this point, though, that they are still on the property as our tenant and still delivering their excellent programming. They just don't own the property anymore. So that was one example, but I think, again, our initial thinking really was pretty off in terms of how that might impact our work.
Okay, thank you all so much. And Rob, if you wouldn't mind closing, thank you.
Well, and thanks to all of you who joined us today. We do hope you'll come back next week for the 5th in the webinar series. It is a talk on Frederick Law Olmsted and Charles Elliott, our founder, the mentor and the student, 1880 to 1890. And for all webinar recordings and a list of future webinars with registration links, you can visit the trustees.org/webinars, and that will give you all the information that you need. So again, everything you heard about today would not be possible without our donors, especially top supporters like our Founders Circle members like you. So thank you again for joining us today, for investing in our mission and our work, and for believing in a brighter future. Thanks again, and hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.